Before we go into the gist of the show, let's take a look at tomorrow's headlines. PDM back at fighting what they call unreasonable Article 47 of the Constitution. This has to do with the parliamentary list. Of course, the party is in court, with some members challenging the party's decision to change the parliamentary list. Another story you can expect tomorrow is the Fishrod bail hearing that's back in court. ACC investigator Andres Kanyangela is being cross-examined by the lawyer of the three of the applicants, Mr. Vassoni. Also, SWAPO Politburo refuses to recognize Susan Hikopo's suspension. Well, the politics in Nochozonjupa, the dust refuses to settle. SWAPO Party SG Sophia Shaningwa says the Politburo has not endorsed the suspension of Hikopo, so she remains in office. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, viewers. I'm Matthias Aufiku, news editor of the Namibian Sun newspaper. Welcome to another exciting edition of the Evening Review Show. Tonight, we're joined in studio by Ms. Victoria Weyulu. She's the senior manager for trade facilitation at the Namibia Revenue Agency. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
It's good to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Well, you'll be meeting clearing agents tomorrow for a consultation meeting. Well, in Windhoek that is. What can we expect from tomorrow's meeting?
Well, really, the engagement tomorrow is to... So over the past few weeks, the Namibia Revenue Agency has invited stakeholders and your clearing agents to provide input to the draft rules on the licensing of clearing agents. So these rules articulate, or they set out the requirements and the circumstances under which clearing agents will be licensed under or in line with Article or Section 73 of the Customs and Excise Act. So what we're going to do at tomorrow's engagement is to consult with stakeholders, with clearing agents, and to find out what are the comments they have in respect of the rules, what are the suggestions they have to improve the rules, and maybe also find out what are some of the challenges that they can identify in respect of particularly the implementation of those rules.
Okay. Well, some people might be wondering, but why is there a need for these new rules when it comes to licensing? What necessitated that move?
That is a very good question, and I think it really deals with the history of and the role of the Ministry of Finance and then the predecessor, which is your Namibia Revenue Agency. So particularly in 2020, the Ministry of Finance had approved new requirements for the licensing of clearing agents. But since these criteria or these requirements were approved in 2020, they have not yet been operational. And a large or the biggest challenge in implementing those requirements at the time was the absence of a framework on addressing what we call unfinalized or dormant entries. Now what I mean by dormant entries is really the lodging or the registration of declarations on what we call the Asikuda World System by clearing agents. So once a declaration is lodged or registered, it is then assessed to find out what are the duties payable in respect of the movement of particular goods, whether it's an import transaction or an export transaction. So once that assessment is conducted, payment is then made and then goods are facilitated across borders. But what we have found is from 2020 up to date, we have now these unfinalized and dormant entries dating as far back as 95. So you will find that for declarations that have been registered on the system, we have outstanding liabilities of about 8 billion. So that means that it is liabilities either due to NamRA that have not been collected. Obviously, there are also other circumstances in which these liabilities may be due to the fault of one or either clearing agent or even customs officials. But the point is that we have not collected registered declarations to that value. And now where the assessed declarations are concerned, there is about an amount of 1 point something billion of outstanding liabilities for assessed declarations. So in our view, that necessitated us to review the entire requirements to make sure that we have put in place internal measures to address these concerns, because they impede not only the successful licensing of clearing agents, but also the collection of revenue where the Namibia Revenue Agency is concerned. Yes.
Well, of course, one of the components of your office is trade facilitations, of which I'm sure clearing agents are an integral part of.
Yes.
And well, of course, there has been this, we call it niggling issue between the two, especially with the advent of NamRA. How has that been handled, especially in anticipation of tomorrow's meeting?
If I understand the question correctly, is maybe what role do we play in the regulation and licensing of clearing agents? And really what happens is the Division of Trade Facilitation Procedures and Compliance is the first point of entry when an application for licensing is made. So we receive the application, and thereafter we determine now what are the requirements in place to facilitate that application. And obviously what we do is also based in terms of one of the functions of the Namibia Revenue Agency, which is outlined in our legislation. The legislation is your Namibia Revenue Agency Act of 2017, and what it says in Section 3E is that one of our core functions is to provide customs and excise services that facilitate trade. Now, in doing so, we receive applications from clearing agents, and we facilitate the inspection of their premises to make sure that everything is in order. They have what is the minimum requirements in terms of internet connection, documentation of the applicable legislation and so forth. And thereafter we facilitate the application, transmit it to the commissioner, because the commissioner is empowered in terms of the Customs and Excise Act to approve and to license clearing agents. So again, really, our role, especially the role of the Division of Trade Facilitation, is just to make sure that we have a transparent framework. And this is what stakeholders will find in Rule 2 of the rules. The object is to make sure that we develop a consolidated framework for the licensing of clearing agents, whereby you have rules that are clear, that are known to everyone, which also is a benefit for us, because in doing so, we facilitate compliance with our customs laws and regulations. Yes.
Well, you speak of revised requirements for licensing of clearing agents. You also speak of the rules on the licensing of clearing agents. Can you just break down the difference between the two? Are you talking about the same thing?
Well, yes and no. Yes, because when I refer to the requirements or the revised requirements, this is really what I refer to the process that the Ministry of Finance undertook from 2015, which ended in 2020. So you recall during that period, the Ministry of Finance, they had instituted a moratorium. In other words, they stopped the licensing of any clearing agent pending the revision of the old requirements. And in 2020, that process was complete, and now these new requirements or the revised requirements were supposed to be implemented, to be operationalized. And an interesting aspect of that is one of these new requirements that were introduced was the need for clearing agents to undergo what we call a proficiency or competency test. So those are part of the revised requirements. But as I've previously explained, these revised requirements have not been operational. So we have not used them to date. And the reason we have not used them is because there was no clear framework in terms of those revised requirements for how we, the institution, must deal with the unfinalized or dormant entries. So now when I speak about the rules on the licensing of clearing agents, this is now the revision of the revised requirements. In other words, what are we now going to do? These rules articulate what are we going to do to unfinalized or dormant entries insofar as it deals with clearing agents. So it is just a revision of the requirements that have been in existence. Yes.
Okay. Well, Ms. Weyulu, we'll go for a short ad break and we'll be back after that to continue this conversation.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I can't answer. I can't answer. Please look for her.
Well, welcome back from that short ad break. Well, Ms. Weyulu, let's continue this conversation. Tomorrow's meeting obviously is a consultative one.
Yes.
So what will happen to the input received from the stakeholders around the rules on the licensing? Or because some are saying that this is already a foregone conclusion, that whatever they say, it might not even be incorporated into this.
Well, that is not entirely true. You know, the purpose of consultation is really to make sure that you receive input from those who are to be regulated by the regulations or by the rules, to make sure that they also have an input. And I say this while taking into account also what the provisions of the World Trade Organization Trade Facilitation Agreement states.
Yeah.
In Article 12, it states that member states are required to request for input, but also to consult stakeholders insofar as the development of trade regulations is concerned. So not only do we have an obligation to make sure that we request for input, we also have an obligation to make sure that their input is included in what will be the final document. So what will happen once we receive the input from stakeholders, we will consolidate the input, and thereafter the input will be approved by the management for the Namibia Revenue Agency to make sure that it is published in the government gazette. So that is also part of the wider requirements to make sure that the rules are transparent, and that they are predictable, and that they are available to the wider or broader stakeholder.
Yeah, is there a date in sight perhaps as to when NamRA wants to effect these rules?
As soon as possible. That would be my immediate answer.
Yeah.
But it also, I think, it will also depend largely on the kind of input that we receive at tomorrow's consultation. So depending on the input we receive, which will also inform the processes that need to be undertaken, it is really difficult at this point to say, well, give us 2 weeks, give us 3 weeks, because it will be entirely dependent on what we need to do with the input that we receive from stakeholders tomorrow.
Yeah. So how different is the proposed rules or regime compared to the older one? Why is it causing so much havoc and uncertainty? Is it that different?
Yes, it is quite different from the old regime, particularly because you have this component where we are introducing a requirement for clearing agents to undergo a competency test. Now, it is not uncommon, because a competency test is something that occurs even in the United States. It happens even in Lesotho, for example. But we have not had it in Namibia. And the reason for introducing a competency test is to make sure that clearing agents know what they're supposed to do. When you do that, you also facilitate compliance, because then they are complying with the customs laws and procedure. And the minute you enhance compliance, what do? You also maximize revenue collection. So I think where we are concerned, this is an important addition to the rules. But also, if you take into account the outstanding liabilities that we previously spoke about, it means that those will be decreased. So in many other countries, they don't have a problem where they have unfinalized or dormant entries, because they make sure that their clearing agents are aware of what their responsibilities are. So the other changes, for example, also relate to, and I think one of the biggest changes, what do we do with the unfinalized or dormant entries? And really, this proposal takes into account the provisions of the law. So you would have the customs and excise legislation that requires traders to keep records for 5 years.
Yeah.
But then we are saying we have unfinalized or dormant entries dating as far back as 95. So where should we get those entries from? So one of the recommendations in the rules is also to do away with the requirement to provide supporting documentations for entries which are older than 5 years, to make sure that we are able to acquit or clear some of those unfinalized dormant entries on the system. Yes.
Well, in terms of trade facilitation, of course, which is quite important to the country, and then juxtaposing it with the competency test, what then happens if most of the agents don't happen to meet the threshold that's needed?
All right, so let me just maybe explain the process briefly. So let's say you have 100 clearing agents who undertake the test. The test will be conducted biannually, which means twice a year. So the licensing period starts from January to December.
Yeah.
So ideally what we would want to have is in January, you already have your first competency or proficiency test. And then if from 100, only 50 pass, then unfortunately it means that the next 50 have to participate in the test that is taking place in the middle of the year, because we are going to conduct 2 tests in the year. But what it means is that, like your driver's license, once you have passed your competency test, it is your certificate that you can use to renew your subsequent applications.
So you don't have to sit for the test every year?
No, you don't have to. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's one of the issues that were not so clear, especially when considering the public debate out there. Also, the other issue is, of course, you mentioned that you can't give a definite time frame as to when these rules will come into effect. But in terms of the testing and so on, what will this be based on, the contents of these competency tests that you are talking about?
So generally, there are certain rules and procedures and regulations that clearing agents need to be aware of. And in saying that, I would like to highlight the process that happened last year. So last year, we held our first competency test or proficiency test under NamRA. And we had a number of clearing clerks, which are really agents of clearing agents, who came to write the test. And they would... And what they would be requested to know is your conventions, your procedures on the ground, what does an SAD 500 looks like, how do you lodge or register it on Asikuda. And what we subsequently found was that there was a mismatch between what we were asking clearing agents to know vis-a-vis what they knew based on practice. So what we did thereafter is to conduct what we call an assessment after the examinations. These took place sometime in March or April. So we then conduct an assessment to find out what exactly do we need our clearing agents to know. And that is what our proficiency tests today are based on. We have developed our training manuals based on that assessment that was conducted. And just to make sure that we are relevant, we are asking for relevant information to enable clearing agents to comply with our procedures and regulations. Yes.
Well, you've mentioned that at least one of the things that the new rules will bring into force is to decrease the liabilities. How certain are we of that? Considering what you just said now, that what they know as per the field and as per the theoretical framework, it seems to be, there seems to be a discord there.
I think the discord was already addressed by conducting the assessment. I think with the assessment, we really tried to decrease the gap in such a way that not only in such a way that clearing agents know what we expect them to know, but also in such a way that we are also aware of the practicalities or realities on the ground. So not in any way diminishing the standards of whatever it is they're supposed to know, but I think it is a situation where the customs authority is really consulting clearing agents to be able to come up with something that works for the country especially. Now, in terms of decreasing liabilities, I think one of the biggest challenges is that if you do not convey the information, if you do not consult, nobody knows. So the idea or the intention with the consultations and the rules is to say, this is what we expect. I think in the past, we also had no framework in place to say, we are not going to allow unfinalized entries of this much for up to this period.
Yeah.
That was also one of the things that was missing in the past. And this is here now in the rules. We are saying for a certain time, we are not going to allow clearing agents to accumulate these many entries on the system to make sure that we curb or reduce the amount of those unfinalized or dormant entries.
Yeah.
So there's quite a few things that are being proposed. And like you said, there's a lot of talk, and I'm very excited to hear that there's a lot of talk about the rules because we are excited to finalize them and finally start implementing and operationalizing them.
Yeah. Maybe just as we wrap up, the issue of bureaucracy in the system and just a lot of layers, transaction costs and so on, it has been a thorny issue, especially in the public sector.
Okay.
Perhaps from your side as a revenue agency, what are you doing to ensuring that these processes are streamlined and as efficient as possible?
I think one of the biggest functions of both the Namibia Revenue Agency in terms of all our international commitments is to facilitate trade. And that is what facilitating trade means. It looks at how the procedures governing the movement of goods can be improved so that you reduce costs, you maximize efficiency, while you're safeguarding legitimate trade.
Yeah.
Now, what we are doing particularly with the rules, ensuring transparency, predictability, all of those is lowering costs because the minute you know what you're supposed to do, you're going to do it. If you don't do it, we can facilitate you knowing how to do it. That is really where we are. It is not only a question about saying we want to talk to you about the rules. It's much deeper than that.
Yeah.
It goes into creating a transparent, a predictable legal framework, but it also goes into creating a culture of compliance, a culture of voluntary compliance where our clearing agency is concerned. And when you do that, it not only just says we are going to enhance revenue collection. Revenue collection can only be enhanced if we comply. And if we comply, it means subsequently that we are also reducing other associated costs. And this is really why we are inviting the public to provide their input and to participate in these stakeholder engagements.
Yeah.
Yes.
Ms. Weyulu, thank you very much for your time tonight.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure and all the best.
Thank you so much.
Good.